Well, if we think about that, and we look at the effect of education, the relation of female education to the economy, we could also turn that around, and we could think about the effect of female education on the family, not the family on female education, but rather female education on the family. Now, one of the things that we observe if we look across the world is in those countries where women are educated, you tend to have the lowest birth rates. One could argue, well, that's simply a change in the culture, a change in values, but there are other ways to think about that problem. You've thought about that a whole lot over your career, and it seems to me that one of the things we ought to be focused on are what are some of the policy implications and what's the importance of educating women in terms of changing the demographics that we see occurring in the world right now.
First of all, way we would explain that would be that more educated women are good at producing sort of human capital of their children. They spend more time with them, they teach them. A lot of the teaching goes on in the home. It's easy to take the simple view that, well, you send children to school to learn, but we know that's not true, that the children are differently prepared by the time they enter school, and children who come from more educated households are much better prepared by the time they enter school, and that difference in preparation lasts with them and becomes increasingly important. So one of the crucial reasons why people coming out of less educated households often have a tough time in school and end up not getting so much education is they weren't prepared as well. So when these educated women are preparing their children much better, they're sort of substituting their time in terms of investing more in each child, and as a result having fewer children. That's what economists call the quality-quantity trade-off. That's maybe not the best language, but that's what we so they have fewer children, but they invest more in each child. So that explains the association between the education of the mothers and the low fertility. Now that has public policy implications, I think, that are very striking and very important. Because we do know that one of the major sources of inequality in a modern economy is that some children get much poorer, lower quality education than other children. The question is, why is that? I think it has to start with family structure, not simply wealth, that's part of it, but also the education of the parents, especially the mothers, who are still the major specialists in child rearing and preparing their children for a productive life. And the problem facing society is how can we overcome this difference in opportunity between children coming out of less favorable families, broken families, low educated families, with children coming out of more stable families. The U.S. has been based on the principle of equality of opportunity. That's the principle that's guided our society for 200 years. It's a principle I fervently believe in. I think most people believe in the United States. When we find that principle being violated, when there's discrimination against particular minorities and so on, that bothers most Americans because it violates this principle of equality of opportunity. And therefore the challenge is, with regard to education, how can we improve the opportunities available to children who are coming out of households where they're less well prepared? Now that varies a lot from society to society. I've been a little bit involved in a program in Mexico called Progressor with very poor households, I mean much poorer than what we would call the poor in the United States, who withdraw their children from school typically after 4 to 6 years of schooling, despite the fact that there are compulsory schooling laws that would mandate they spend longer in school because they can't afford to keep their kids out of school for so long. And Progressor is a program that tries to bribe the parents by offering the parents a certain amount per month for, as long as their children attend school on a regular basis and do reasonably well in it. And it's been very successful. And we have evidence now that a program like Progressor has increased significantly the years of schooling obtained by these very poor families who enrolled in this program. Well, the United States doesn't have that type of poverty, but we also have to try to face more effectively than we have faced, how can we improve the educational preparation and educational levels achieved by the children coming out of disadvantaged families. And I think there are a number of things we can do. I'm a strong supporter of vouchers, for example. I think the education of people in middle-class families is pretty good in the United States, even K to 12, but it's not so good in the inner city schools. And one of the reasons it's not so good is they're faced with a monopoly of the public school system. They don't have much choice. They can't afford to move to better suburbs. And vouchers and other choice-based systems give these families, even very poor families, greater choice on what school their children can attain.
Much of your work has been on the family and on population. One of the big changes in the world in recent years has been a dramatic decline in fertility rates in the Catholic countries from rates that were well above the rest of the developed world, Protestant countries like England and the United States, to a point where now those countries actually have lower fertility rates than the other countries. What's going on there? Why is that? Is it government policy? Is it changes in values, changes in culture? How would you explain that?
Well, I think the changes in fertility rates, let me go back a little bit, because I think there's a revolution going on in fertility rates in the world, and the Catholic, non-Catholic one is one aspect of that revolution. If you look in the 1950s, I have a table someplace, how many countries in 1950s had fertility rates below replacement? That is, on the average, a woman would have less than 2 children over her lifetime. There were 3 or 4 tiny countries, Estonia, countries like that. If you go to the 1970s, there were about 20 some countries, pretty much every one of the earlier countries, plus a whole host of new ones. If you go to the 1990s, there's almost 60 countries. About half the world's population now has fertility rates that are below replacement. Every country 20 years ago had it, with one minor exception, still has it, plus they've been joined by about 30 additional countries. So there's a population divide between half the population that has below replacement fertility, and some of these countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, some of the Asian countries like Japan, Korea have fertility rates that are way below replacement. So in a short period of time, maybe 10 to 20 years, their populations will begin to decline unless some significant change occurs. The other parts of the world, fertility has also come down, but it's significantly above replacement. And that would be Africa, parts of Latin America, India still, and a few other countries, Indonesia, some of the other countries. So there are 2 questions that I think one has to be addressed. Why this great decline in fertility? And then to come back to your question, which I think is a sub-part of this question, why has the Catholic, non-Catholic differential been basically eliminated, and if anything, there's some movement the other way. The Catholics have lower fertility. Now, I don't think we have any difficulty in understanding why fertility has come down a lot in the world, particularly in the developed world. There are many forces associated with development that will lead to low fertility. We mentioned a few earlier, that as people have become more educated, they have substituted having fewer children, but having more human capital invested in their children. So in all these countries, we find, although there are variations in that they have really few children, but they're investing much more in each child than was true in the past. Associated with that are forces like greater labor force participation of women that we spoke about earlier. Cost of the time of women has gone up. The women's more educated women who want to, again, reinforce the tendency to have fewer children and invest more in each child. Growing divorce in many countries, so that people don't want to commit themselves to so many children when their marriages are much less stable. And we can go on maybe into other factors. Whether this explains the very low fertility rates, I don't think we know. But it certainly explains why there's been an enormous decline in fertility over time, why fertility is much lower now than it was even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. Now, the Catholic, non-Catholic phenomena is more difficult to understand. It's found not only between countries, but also in the United States. If you look now in the United States, there's virtually no difference in fertility of Catholics and non-Catholics. Well, when I first started studying fertility, one of the important variables in any discussion was the fact that even if you hold for comparable income and comparable years of schooling, Catholics had significantly higher birth rates than non-Catholic and Protestants in the United States. No longer true. It's about the same now. It's not because Catholics income and education is so much above that of Protestants. They're very similar on the average, not very little difference. I think what's happened within the Catholic population is that economic forces have trumped religion, basically, that the power of these economic forces, namely increased labor force participation of women, greater education of women, greater income, has dominated their behavior. And even though the Catholic Church has remained in its opposition to birth control techniques other than the rhythm method, to condoms and the like, even very practicing Catholics, very devout Catholics, are violating church teachings in this area.